First of all, I want to thank everyone for coming today. As you all have heard, that the post-Irene Property Task Force has just issued their final draft to the Senate in a unique parliamentarian fashion, and that was as a committee of the whole. The Senate as a whole heard testimony from the Commission and the task force. What they were listening to was some of the recommendations that were developed through this task force and this group that was put together back in the fall. And as I've said before, what started the genesis of this task force was upon seeing a lot of the damage within the days following Irene. It was clear to me, at least from my legal standpoint, that we were facing issues where not only people lost their homes, but they also lost the property that the homes were on. And this was a very unique situation. Even if you look across the country, there are many natural disasters, but they really generally will take the property such as homes or buildings, but rarely does it take all of the land like it did and create such an impact on a state. So at that point in time, I thought it was really extremely important to get the best minds working to identify issues that may come up this session in order for us to get a jump start. The last thing we needed to do was to wait until the session started before we started identifying issues that would have arisen as a result of Irene. So at that time, I called Bob Paolini, and Bob absolutely was right there to answer the call. And I just, before I turn it over to Bob, I must say this, is that, we saw such incredible acts of generosity and volunteerism throughout the days following Irene. And, where individuals were helping other folks clean out their own homes. And what you have here with this task force is a group of people, professionals from the legal community, from the banking community, real estate. We have leagues of cities and towns, obviously representing the municipalities. We had small businesses and large businesses, landlords and tenants, all came together to work together to try to identify some of the problems that the devastation of Irene caused. And in my mind, that is, number one, it is precedent setting, and I can't tell you how wonderful it is to see these people and entities working together for the betterment and improvement of Vermont. So at this time, I would give you Bob Paolini, and thank you, first of all, Bob, from my perspective. You've done a great job, and if you could just address.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Senator. Some of you just heard our report to the Senate. We spoke to the entire Senate as a joint committee, and we delivered some recommendations and ideas on 5 different subject areas. Those areas are finance and insurance, general property law, public records, housing, and planning, rebuilding, and recovery. Our report contains some proposed legislation, but it also contains suggestions for continued work between the state agencies and the professional associations that were part of this group, as we both try to respond to Irene and better position all of us for another disaster that may hit us in the future. What the senator said was correct about the number of volunteers and the amount of time they put in very short notice. We began meeting November 3rd, and we finished on December 14th, and pulled together the report that you may have gotten a copy of this morning. It's also available on the Vermont Bar Association's website, and soon we will transmit it electronically to the legislature's website. Without the willingness for those people to come together and spend their time over 2 months to put together this report, we wouldn't be here today. So again, I want to thank Senator Campbell for pulling us together, and I especially want to thank Chris Delia, president of the Vermont Bankers, who was the vice chair, and all of the people, most of whom were behind me, who were members of of this task force and worked over those 2 months.
Could you just identify the chairs of the 5 committees?
Certainly, certainly. The Finance and Insurance Subcommittee was chaired by Chris Delia. The General Property Law Subcommittee was chaired by Hal Miller, who chairs the Vermont Bar Association's Property Law section. The Public Records Subcommittee was chaired by Jill Spinelli, also an attorney with in the Vermont Bar Association Property Law section. The Housing Subcommittee was chaired by Jessica Radward, who is actually Vermont's Poverty Law Fellow, presently working at Vermont Legal Aid in Burlington. And the final group, Planning, Rebuilding, and Recovery, was co-chaired by Representative Allison Clarkson and Adam Luigi from the Addison County Regional Planning Commission.
Great, thank you. Any questions?
Yeah, as you pointed out, the genesis for this was kind of the homes that were washed away along with the land and sort of the legal questions that arise from that. But I haven't really heard anything today, or I didn't really notice anything, at least in the first part of the report, directly related to that.
Well, actually what happened is in going through, not only did they weren't tasked with just coming up with legislation, because actually specifically I asked, I don't think it would be to our benefit if we all of a sudden developed or had recommendations for 100 bills to try to solve problems. So what they did was they were able to go through what existing law was, number one, and also existing rules and regulations to see if any of them would have would come into play. And I believe, as Bob pointed out earlier, that there were certain laws we found out that may have been a bit old and rusty, and we had to kind of dust them off a bit. But some of those did pertain. Is that correct, Bob?
I think that's fair to say.
Yeah.
And did that?
Hal, why don't you come up and Hal might be able to address
And
this.
did you find that to be the case with this particular question of where,
Yes, that's exactly it. A lot of the old laws dealing with riparian and littoral rights come out of our case law, and there are some, by property standards, recent cases from the 1800s, but they're by other standards that really, long-standing law involving that. We also had to look at the permit issues, and that's one thing we did address in the report today.
So are there any new proposed pieces of legislation?
As far as the permit issue goes, what we suggested was, we didn't have actually proposed legislation, but we suggested that they look into shortening the period for which towns can enact interim zoning, and also look into the situation where, not necessarily with legislation, but through rulemaking and regulations dealing with state septic permits, that they have a procedure where you can come in, make emergency repairs, and then contact the state to get whatever permit you had to get and not be faced with a violation situation, and that's in fact how it has worked out.
And a lot of, before I turn this over to Chris, because Chris has something else to add, but one of the things that I was really impressed with is the fact that there were so many people who did work, whether it be, and of course they didn't have permits because the issue was, can we do emergency work right now without having to go through permits? And it was clear, the administration made it clear for you to do what you needed to do to get everything up and working. And what was admirable is the fact that we saw so many people actually repairing their property, repairing septic systems, and going along the guidelines. And so it was, and they didn't have to have the threat of the permits over their heads. So I think what this shows is that Vermonters do recognize the importance of our environmental regulations and the clear purpose for them. So I was really impressed with how Vermonters responded to that. But Chris, I want you to address the finance issue that you...
Yeah, a couple of things to keep in mind. First, we're dealing with the immediate response to Tropical Storm Irene and those folks impacted, but we also have preparations for the next event that may occur in Vermont. So to give you two examples, the first would be the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. If municipalities are able to work with those homeowners, is a program that's available today for the purchase of those properties that are in the hazard area. And that's an immediate response to those individuals. For future purposes, as we noted in the report, for the Commerce Committee in the House and the Finance Committee in the Senate, to look at the financial institutions' response to Irene to see whether any type of standardized approach is warranted. So just to give you a couple of examples of an immediate response and then also planning for the future.
Are there any statistics available? I think I've seen about 700 homes were actually destroyed, but how many cases are there of people seeking hazard mitigation? How many cases are there of people whose property lines were altered by rivers changing course? Do we know?
And I think that number's still being put together. I don't, Jen, you all, Jen, do you have that information as far as from the administration? What we're doing now is we're working with the administration. As you know, Sue Minter has now gone from deputy, from VTrans, is now working with, as the recovery czar, if you will. And we had a meeting with the Speaker's office the other day to discuss the fact that they will be having a liaison with us, with this committee, to help identify all those issues. And of course, one of the major parts is to find out about the hazard mitigation, especially as you know, the administration has stated that we are going to deal with the remaining 25% from the VHCB fund. So obviously we need to know what that total package will be.
Are there any new bills being introduced in this report, though?
There have been bills that have been introduced in the interim while the report was coming out. We had where we were working with certain legislators to actually draft bills based on the findings and recommendations in the report. But there will be other ones. One of the I have, as pro tem, I've given my committee's authorization through our rules that they will be able to come up with committee bills now based on any recommendations that they receive from this report, so they won't be held as far as because not meeting crossover or not being introduced on time.
Do we know how many at this point?
No, we won't know at this point. And again, what we're looking for, and my caveat to this whole issue with the senators has been, you know, get this information, receive these recommendations, and find what we can build on now, what we already have in existence. We don't want to, as I said, create 100 new laws just based on this, because I think because of the hard work from the committee members, we found that there are, because of our common law, there are many issues we can work through that will not require statutory change, just either clarification or rule change within the administration.
Are there any bills that you're committed, you know, related to this that were mentioned in the report? You know, I think of Ginny Lyons, you know, propane tank bill.
Yeah.
So are there what
Yeah.
bills are you committed to passing?
I'm going to bring up Allison Clarkson, who's a representative from Woodstock, and she has had several bills, and also Sarah
Right.
Buxton. Sarah, why don't you all come on up?
I'd say we have at the moment, about 3 bills that I can think of that are going to be new. One is the law school planners bill
Right.
that Sarah is introducing. David Dean and I are introducing a statewide regulation for flood hazard areas that also requires flood insurance for all properties in flood hazard zones. And we also have the emergency housing rental registry bill. Those are 3 new bills that I know of, and I'm sure there are several others.
And amendments to existing bills, like the non-discrimination housing bill, I think it's H59, also has now proposed amendments to it.
Right. So that's 4, but you know, there probably will be a few more. Deadline isn't until 4:30 today.
Yeah.
Do we know roughly about how many amendments there are?
I think that will happen as the committees take them up, and you'll see committee bills coming out in committee editions.
And what happens is, again, the individual bills do have the cutoff that the individual representatives, they have until today, again, as you mentioned, to believe 4:30 to introduce bills. However, once this goes through the committee process, there will be committees that there may be bills or existing legislation currently that we'll be able to work upon. So, but we'll have the vehicles, let's just put it that way.
Can you talk about what comfort this report may give to people who have lost their land or have lost their homes and aren't really being adequately compensated and may end up foreclosing?
Well, you know, the issue, especially with the finance, and I'm going to turn it over to Chris in just a second, but you know, there are people who have had their properties where they've had extensive mortgages. They may have mortgages of $200,000 or $300,000, and there is no property there left. And those are issues that we have looked at, and we've been working with the banks. And I must tell you that our local banks, the state banks, in-state banks, have been incredible with trying to work with people and helping them try to come up with some plan to be able to take care of the mortgages. However, quite frankly, there are going to be those individuals out there that still have a large mortgage, and some of the federal banks, and I know Bank of America is one that hasn't been too keen to rush in to be of help, and I have been working with our federal delegation to discuss a few items that we would like to address from a national level, but that's not going to be anything soon, nor will it be anything that will address the problems that have been that people have incurred here, or the property loss people have incurred in this storm. But this is something for us to understand of what may happen in the future. There has been a bill, I believe a bill going to be introduced that would deal with destroyed properties, and that's my understanding is in the House, and I don't know its current status. But again, I must reiterate the fact that some of our in-state banks have just been incredible. And Chris, if you can try to address some of the other questions Ann brought up.
So I think it's a great question to ask, what are we doing today? And it's really been ongoing for the last 3 or 4 months, the activities we've been involved with homeowners, both on a short-term and a long-term basis. What's important to keep in mind is there are pieces to the puzzle that you need to have in place before final decisions can be made as to the ultimate response for those homeowners. But as we talked about in the committee just recently this morning, for example, we know that many of the mobile homeowners out there are going to be struggling to take on additional debt to replace the home that they lost. We're working with the Agency of Commerce and housing groups and others to try and figure out what's the most appropriate response to that, whether it's a loan program or a program where we use part loan, part equity infusion with groups like the Community Foundation and others to help support those individuals get back into safe and secure housing. So these efforts are ongoing and have been ongoing for several months.
The other thing, and if I could just point out too, is that Vermont's really fortunate that they do have many foundations, community foundations, as Chris just mentioned. The Stratton Foundation down south, I know, has been working very closely with homeowners down there and to help them with some of the losses that they've had. But quite frankly, the losses are so significant when you really add up some of the mortgages, and I don't have the exact amount, but I do know that it's more than any one community foundation can deal with. And so those are issues that these folks have to work out, and we're trying to create that liaison between them and their banks to try to work out some type of plan that will be that they can use and that can help them get through this period.